me tell you a story about an album, a vinyl record album, the old days, 1977. An album that was the highest selling jazz album in history at that time, and the highest selling solo piano album of any genre. And it nearly didn't happen. It was in Cologne in the Opera House, and this 17-year-old concert promoter, the youngest concert promoter in Germany, Vera Brands, had this dream of an improvised jazz piano concert in the Cologne Opera House. Unusual, unheard of really. Anyway, she put a dream to the authorities of the Opera House and they agreed. But it had to be late night after the ordinary opera performance. So as it set for 11:30, she invited Keith Jarrett, the well-known jazz pianist from New York, to come and play. And he agreed, and he requested a particular Bosendorfer grand piano, a bit different from this old fella. And the request was approved. On the day, or the concert was promoted, it was a sellout, 1,400 tickets were sold. And on the day, late afternoon, Keith Jarrett and his musical director arrived at the Cologne Opera House. They'd driven across part of continental Europe from another gig that they'd done a couple of nights earlier. Tired and worn out a bit weary, and not 100% well, I don't think. It was cold, it was winter, it was raining. Anyway, they appear on the stage. Vera shows them around and introduces Keith to the grand piano that he's going to play. He and the musical director walked around, they tinkled a few notes, pressed the key, the pedals, looked at it, wandered off to the side and had a conference. After a few minutes, the musical director came over to Vera Brands and said, "Look, unless you get a real piano, Keith just won't be able to perform tonight." She was stunned, she was shocked, confused. What's wrong? She later discovered that what had happened was the piano removalists in the Opera House couldn't find the particular piano that was requested. And they'd found this other Bosendorfer piano, a smaller grand, and they'd put it on the stage and they'd gone home for the day. There's no one in the Opera House who could help her. And she was desperate. The piano tuner was called in. The problems were the piano was grossly out of tune. Well, that could be fixed. But the high notes were a bit thin and tinny. The low notes, they weren't clear. They were more muffled. And the pedals stuck. It just wasn't, and it was too small. It wasn't going to fill the Opera House well. So she, in desperation, called some friends and they'd agreed to come and help push a brand new grand piano from the music store down the road up into the Opera House. But the piano tuner who'd arrived said, "Look, don't do that. It'll be destroyed before you even get here." So he worked on it, got it into tune, did some repairs and what he could, as best he could. Piano still wasn't ideal, but anyway, Vera went out to the car and stood in the pouring rain. Keith was in his car, sort of having a snooze, catching up on a bit of sleep. And she spoke to him through the window and begged him and pleaded him. And he could see this water running down her face. And maybe in pity he said, "Remember this, always remember this, only for you." So that night, 11:30, Keith Jarrett came out on stage. He sat before this inferior, imperfect piano. A piano that wasn't loud enough, that the high notes were a bit thin, the low notes a bit muffled. And from the first notes that he played, the audience knew that something special was happening. For Keith that night, it was to be very vulnerable. He couldn't play the normal style. You know, his hands couldn't go where they normally would. His intuitive movements, the well-rehearsed movements that would take him and find those tunes and those places couldn't happen. He was incredibly vulnerable because this instrument was very inferior, nothing that a professional musician would use. It was backwards for him. And he had to play within the strengths of this piano and discover them and find them and work with him. And this instrument that no professional musician would employ, would use, was on the stage and was the instrument for this concert. And Keith had to draw out of it the very best he could. And he did. He played a lot of arpeggios down low to hide the muffledness. He didn't go too high too often, but played more in the middle. And it was a stunning piece. It was soft, so he had to stand at times and hit to get the volume. It was a stunning performance where musician and instrument created a melody that touched the hearts and the lives, the mood of the people in the Opera House that night. There was something stirred within them. They heard this music and it touched their soul, touched them. For me, that's an example or a story that reflects something of the deep reality of a story that is called the Pentecost story in the church. That the first festival of Pentecost, a Jewish festival after the first Easter, 120 followers of Jesus are gathered in this room waiting for what will happen next. They've been through the process of grief, his death, his resurrection, what that meant, and they're told to wait. The Spirit of God would come upon them in power, but not the power of might and Rome and domination, bonds, the power of love, of resurrection, whatever that meant for them. And they were gathered in this room, and this morning on this Feast of Pentecost, which an ancient festival of harvest, but one that also remembered the giving of the law, Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai, the formation of this nation. They gathered to celebrate, but the Spirit came on them like wind and fire in this power, this wonder, and it enlivened them. And these people that lived in fear and uncertainty and confusion became hopeful, joyful, confident, and courageous. And they took some risks. They were vulnerable, like Keith Jarrett on the piano. And like Keith playing this instrument that was weak and vulnerable, the Spirit filled them and created a song, a sound, a music that resonated in the hearts and the minds and the lives of all those in the city that day. They spoke in the languages of the empire, all the languages, and people heard the reign of God, the love of God's reign proclaimed in their language, the language of their heart. And there was transformation as people responded in joy and hope to this message, to this life, to this way. It's also a story of connections, of relationships. The Spirit brings people together, creates community, creates connections and love and wonder. And we hear in this week of reconciliation with the indigenous peoples of this land, the First Peoples, we hear in their story the stories of Spirit. Across the nations of the indigenous peoples, the Spirit had spoken, had lived and had dwelt amongst the people. The Spirit had different names and forms across these nations, but the Spirit spoke and brought them, developed this creative, complex relationship, not only with one another, but with the land. Gave them incredible wisdom about how to live in this land and live with this land, to gain food and resources and life. The Spirit gave them song and dance and dream time and stories that sustained them. This story of Acts is a story for our world in the midst of COVID-19, as people are isolated, waiting. Maybe the Spirit can speak to us and connect us in different ways. The network of digital technology, of Zoom and Facebook and emails and phones, and the ways we connect, bringing us together in relationship, in love. And maybe it can bring us into a deeper connection with each other and with the earth. And in this COVID-19 world, we have to work together as a world, as a human family. and understand that we are just one species, and the rest of the world, the earth, can get by without us quite well. In fact, it needs a rest from us. And if we can gain the wisdom of the Spirit that's spoken into indigenous peoples throughout the world, throughout history, we might learn to live in relationship with the earth, one with the earth, with each other, and with the God who created us all. May God be with you. Amen.
Welcome everybody. As is our way, I'd like to acknowledge the country that we're meeting on today, myself on Barramadigal country, now known as Parramatta, and I acknowledge the country that you are each on. We acknowledge that Aboriginal peoples are the traditional and ongoing custodians of country, and that they have cared for country since the time of creation. We pay our respects to our elders, past and present, and to all of Australia's First Peoples. We thank them for their custodianship of the land on which we stand today. We acknowledge that the Spirit speaks to all people in all places, across different cultures and different languages. For Aboriginal people, we can see the Spirit's presence in creation stories and in peoples who developed complex, sustainable relationships with the land. We thank God for the rich diversity of cultures and languages of our First Peoples. May we tread softly in our journeys and remember those who have gone before us. Thank you.
The reading today comes from Acts chapter 2, verse 1 to 21 from the New Revised Standard Version. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting.
그때에 경건한 유대인들이 천하 각국으로부터 와서 예루살렘에 머물러 있더니 이 소리가 나매 큰 무리가 모여 각각 자기의 방언으로 제자들이 말하는 것을 듣고 소동하여 무엇은 엄마올라도 뭡니 올라도 워프아이 워프마이 아우타 레오 칼릴레야 에야 일라도 ummo에 토탈라마이 Whapefo o na tātou te tasi, na whanongo atu I lana lawa na ngana na tupu mai mai. O pātia, ma me tai, ma e lama, mai lato umai na nofo I me Sopotamia. Ma iutaia ma Kapatokia, o Ipono ma Asia.
Mai Firitia ke Pamifilia, mai Itipita ke Neasa sa Pakalipia, e vola ke Kikirini, ke Irna Bulangi, mai Roma. Ko Irna Kaichutia, ke Irna Sabuki ke no lotu Wakatiu. Ko Irna Kaikiriti ke Arpia, and the Sarongodi Ira, Nira Sara Tukuna, and a Nonda Bosa, na Nona Vakavaka, and a Ve Wakurumbuitaki na Kalu.
Mereka semuanya tercengang-cengang dan sangat termangu-mangu, sambil berkata seorang kepada yang lain, "Apakah artinya ini?" Tetapi orang lain menyindir, mereka sedang mabuk oleh anggur manis. Maka bangkitlah Petrus, berdiri dengan sebelas rasul itu, dan dengan suara nyaring ia berkata kepada mereka,
யூதர்களே, எருசலேமில் வாசம் பண்ணுகிற ஜனங்களே, நீங்கள் எல்லோரும் அறிந்து கொள்வீர்களாக, என் வார்த்தைகளுக்கு செவி கொடுங்கள். நீங்கள் நினைக்கிறபடி இவர்கள் வெறி கொண்டவர்கள் அல்ல. பொழுது விடிந்து 3ஆம் மணி வேளையாய் இருக்கிறதே. தீர்க்கதரிசியாகிய யோவேலினால் உரைக்கப்பட்டபடியே இது நடந்தேறுகிறது. கடைசி நாள்
말씀하시기를
God declared,
내가 내 영을 모든
Dia
육체에
hari-hari
우리의 자녀든 예언할
For young
것이요
men shall see
젊은이들은 상을
ya maka anak-anakmu laki-laki
even upon my son,
akan berumur
men
내가 내
teruna-terunamu akan mendapat penglihatan-penglihatan.
남정들에게
Orangmu yang tua akan mendapat mimpi.
예언할
Atas
것이요
hamba-hambaku,
내가 위로 하늘에서는
laki-laki dan perempuan, akan kucurahkan rohku
징조를
di hari itu, dan mereka akan berumur. Dan aku
for the coming of the Lord
akan mengadakan mujizat-mujizat di atas
이르기 전에
dan di tanda-tanda di bawah
변하여
mie,
부어지고
api,
달이 변하여
gumpalan-gumpalan asap.
누구든지
Matahari
주의 이름을
akan berubah menjadi hitam dan bulan menjadi darah sebelum datangnya hari Tuhan, hari yang besar dan mulia itu. Dan barang siapa yang berseru kepada nama Tuhan akan diselamatkan.